Lovely to see you all. As you'll have noticed, we've now got another set of panellists on our stage here. So let me tell you what we're going to be talking about. Are shops killing the high street is the question we're asking in this session. You know, I talked earlier, we've mentioned it a couple of times, about there's been a lot, hasn't there, in the headlines about the demise of the high street and some of the big retailers that we've known and loved over the years and what's happening with them. There's clearly problems. So do we finally need to accept that there are simply too many shops? Well, in this session, we're going to look at the innovation happening in retail and how that is changing things. We're going to start by looking at the structural change on the high street. Alistair Parker is going to lead this session. He's head of Retail Development Agency London for Cushman and Wakefield. So put your hands together for Alistair.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm obviously here to extend the diversity offer today, but fortunately there's more of us than just me. Can I introduce you a very eclectic panel, starting out from this side. Ed Templeton, runs the most extraordinary revolving dining experience with revolving experiences, food, art, and he runs it with an enormous band of cousins. Crispin, Lilly of Everyman is charging the boutique offer onto many of our high streets, and I know many of you will know him very well. Whelan is the chief executive of an authority well known for putting its mouth where its money should go, but supporting vigorously their town centre. David Kosky of Work.Life, who put together, I think, the idea of co-working on the roof of an Ibiza nightclub with his mate. Tough work if you can get it. And Guy Nixon of Native, who started and runs one of the largest apart hotel businesses and started it in his own family home, I think, by asking his family to leave. So if I might, I would just like to set a brief context to this. And I thought I'd just give it a bit of the broader vision, or try and give it a bit of broader vision. And this may come as a bit of a shock to some of you, but economically, retail's really not that important to the economy as a whole. In London, it represents about 4% of GVA, and at best, or whatever you take the view of, in Belfast, it's about 8% of GVA. And despite all appearances, retail is enormously resilient. Many of our town centres have done very well for the last 300 or 400 years. But periodically, we do hear about the death of the high street. And there's lots of reasons, apparently, for this. Ever nearing demise, boring retail, taxes, online shopping, clone towns, people under 38. And I think the context is really quite important to remind ourselves, starting with 1951. Few of you will perhaps remember the days you went in, made an order at the counter, and they used to deliver it to your home, a sort of counter and delivery. And in 1951, we had something called the Census of Distribution that enabled us to count the shops. And I think, as you can see, by 2001, we'd lost 50% of the shops we had in 1951. And then we moved most of the shops out of the town centre. And now we have 875,000 shops, but 2/3 of those are not selling retail goods. They're nail bars, car showrooms, banks, caterers, dry cleaners. To give you a slight flavour of that, Colchester was a nice town, doing very well up to 1987. Had two fairly major extensions, adding about 500,000 square feet. Then after 1990, everything went out of town. And then suddenly we started wondering why Colchester wasn't doing very well with 70% of the retail offer out of town. As we know, multiples dominate the business. 300 companies take 72% of the trade. Most of the companies out there are very small. And retail multiples, as opposed to general multiples, only occupy about 100,000 shops. Most shops are occupied by very small businesses. And as we know now, about 70 town centres take most of the trade, leaving a wake of obsolescence and functional disorder. I think not over-provided, but under-demolished. And everyone recognises this. This is from the M&S annual report. I think the real surprise is how slow this is going. I couldn't believe it. M&S report their bad stores have been in the same wrong place for more than 75 years. We have been very busy building effective machine mills. One's a great scale, but not always in our town centres. Apparently, we've recently discovered they don't work as town centres. And this was after our remarkable discovery that successful places are a blend of discourse, shopping, education, culture, and commerce. I think we should recognise the Greek agora was fundamentally a central place for public assembly, then a marketplace with attendant workshops and with offices, and frequently with theatrical and gymnastic performances. I've got one of these great buttons here. Well, internet, non-food sales, 14.4%, slightly different from what people selling software might argue. But I don't think the distinction is very helpful now. The ONS statistics tend to mix and match online and offline sales, and it is very much an omni-channel world we live in. One thing to recognise, I think, we can all agree on the impact of taxes. Enormous lift, DCLG's numbers. I think you might perhaps observe the one thing that isn't killing the high street is rental growth. But with 41% of our economy in the public sector, I think it unrealistic to expect the Chancellor has much room for manoeuvre. But I think fundamentally we recognise, so most shops are not occupied by retailers, most shops are not in town centres, and most of the trade is taken in a handful of centres. But the high street is not about shops. In fact, it's mostly about other uses, and usually small businesses. In Brixton town centre, according to the survey of last year, 40% of the town centre jobs are in professional services, and their economic strategy is about building the local economy. Back in the late 1990s, ODPM and CASA did a study of town centre activity areas, trying to define the statistics for town centres rather than their surrounding districts. And it's quite clear that town centres are a blend of uses, most importantly commercial office employment, even in places like Finchley. So off-centre office parks perhaps ought to join the cast of villains, so it's new offices killing old shops. And it's clear that the most vulnerable centres are those managed events that we largely created in the last 40 years or so, particularly those that were just about shops. So I think many of the economists amongst you would recognise Schumpeter's creative destruction, the recycling of capital that drives productivity. Is this something we should be trying to stop? Can we stop it? Should we be holding up zombie enterprises with collective investment platforms or driving cheap public finance to rescue places that the private sector won't invest in. What should we be doing and how should we do it? So starting off with that, perhaps Ed, you can share with us your experiences of how experiential events take us further forward.
Yes, so we have 2 sites in Marylebone. One split every 3 floors with a restaurant on the ground floor, 2 event spaces, and then an A1 unit next door to that, and we've recently taken on a space in 7 Dials. What we found, I mean, although food is kind of at the core of where we began, and the restaurant's kind of probably still what we're best known for, we've sort of expanded out into doing a lot of events, and we found that a huge number of online brands are coming to us looking for space for anywhere from a day to upwards to a month to do brand activations and kind of interact with their customers who otherwise are kind of interacting with them only online. So that's been quite an interesting development, and I think those brands are still looking for physical space, and someone like us who, as well as kind of doing the events, we're kind of constantly animating the spaces with art exhibitions and creative workshops, kind of anything from making paper flowers to calligraphy to making Chinese dumplings. We're doing all sorts of stuff all of the time to kind of activate, and in doing so creating our own brand that I think when these companies, Amazon or Instagram, whatever, are looking for a space to do something on the high street, I think they look favourably upon someone like us who it's not just an empty space, but we're doing things ourselves. So that's been definitely an observation that we've had recently.
But Crispin, you're driving boutique cinemas on the high streets, and where do you see the advantages to your operation as opposed to an out-of-town multiplex shed?
Well, we want to be part of communities. We want to be part of that collective destination. That's really what excites me, and I love the fact that, as we've expanded over the last 4 or 5 years in particular, yes, we're going into big urban areas, Manchester not quite yet, but Glasgow, Liverpool, and the like, and we can be part of that larger urban landscape. But as exciting for us is going back into smaller, sleepier market towns where we can genuinely be a brilliant catalyst and part of that collective change. But it's taking a change of mindset. And if I may, I kind of wanted to draw a bit of a parallel, if I may, because the cinema sector is obviously significantly even smaller than the retail sector. But in 1984, cinema was dead. Cinema had declined from, in 1946, everyone was going 32 times a year, 1.6 billion cinema admissions, to in 1984 it was dead, 54 million admissions, less than once a year. And the fundamental rationale for that was TV. Suddenly people could watch films and TV in their own home. And the way in which the cinema industry collectively responded to that was in a distressed mindset, constantly just looking to cut costs and carve up cinemas cheaply to try and struggle to survive. And of course, fundamentally, what we're selling and still selling is experience. And you do that, and it's a very quick cycle into despair. What changed that in the mid-'80s was the arrival of the multiplexes and then subsequent all sorts of different iterations of which we're part. But if you look in 1984, we had 3 TV channels. Channel 4 launched in 1984. And if you look over the last 30 years, we've had the emergence of VHS that was going to kill cinema, DVD was going to kill cinema, Blu-ray was going to kill cinema, Sky Cinema was going to kill cinema, Netflix was going to kill cinema, Amazon was going to kill cinema. And yet over that 30 years, cinema admissions have tripled. Because actually there's been this investment and necessity to reinvent what cinema was and focus on the assets, which was the experience. And as it's grown, we've been able to start to diversify in the way that retailers actually had before us, so that I can now, make a business like Everyman work by saying, we can't be all things to all men like the multiplexes try to be, but what we are going to do is try and look at those that are, in the mid-20s, cinema drops off the cliff, but it doesn't mean we stop loving film. So actually, we'll target directly those, and other cinema chains are doing different sorts of targeting, but it means we're doing better at actually targeting customers and delivering what they want. And I would draw that parallel, which is, I am not a retail expert, and please don't write anything down I'm about to say, because it's probably completely wrong. But my perception purely as a consumer is that there are shops out there. A lot of them tend to be independent, artisan shops, but actually a lot of the chains too are making a good attempt to redefine what their retail stores are and to make them more experiential, to recognise that people still like to get out on a Saturday afternoon and go to a place. We want to be part of that, and you can have a much more, in my mind, exciting mix if you've got retail, leisure, commercial even, and residential all being put together. And the natural home for that is the high street, which is exciting for us.
But
Did I answer the question now, Alistair?
Well, it is the it's adding the experience, isn't it? Cinemas were getting to be very dull boxes where the most you could get was Coca-Cola and popcorn. And most of the successful ones, particularly the boutiques and the high street, are real places to go. Now, Guy, you started a business because you looked at, as I understand it, at the hotels you were staying in and thought, these are serially boring.
I need to be careful about that. They're serially boring for extended stay. So Native operates across 2 platforms, build to rent and apart hotels. And on the apart hotel side, I think both of those platforms bring what you've just said. What you need in city centres is more footfall. And to create more footfall, you need more people who are there at different times of the day for different reasons to support the local retail F&B communities and the cinemas and so on and so forth. So if you can bring, as in Manchester, I can't remember the exact statistics, but 10, 15 years ago or so, there were probably less than 10,000 people living in central Manchester. And today, with the explosion of build to rent in Manchester, that is changing dramatically. So by bringing those people back into the city centres, you're creating much more footfall for the retailers and for the F&B, and just bringing more energy into those centres. I also think there is too much retail, and of the wrong type of retail. And one of the ways in which we love to get into city centres is looking at, for example, we bid on a House of Fraser building in Edinburgh recently that was on the market. I'm not sure where the stage of that is. We were the underbidders on it, but it was an opportunity to take a classic, iconic Art Deco, 120,000 square foot department store that was on its knees, and turn it into a kind of a restaurant, cinemas, co-working, and 125 room apart hotel above. And our view was that was exactly what that Princes Street High Street needed. So we love those kind of opportunities, and we think we can really add value to the High Street in that way.
But David, your thinking on co-working also involves, you have an interest in a ground floor presence, in reanimating the space into working off a street rather than being suspended in corporate floors above.
7th floor somewhere.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I mean, our strategy has always been almost quasi-retail, and landlords have viewed us almost like they used to, how they've used retail in the past. We take smaller locations, so sort of 10 to 15,000 square foot, so we can deliver a really personal product, to our members. But for landlords, because we focus on smaller space on the ground floor, it means that we actually help them animate their buildings. So we've always understood the power of being visible from the ground floor. I think the interesting thing, I mean, recently we've been, you talk about the high street and retail, recently we've been approached by a lot of landlords who are seeing sort of the explosion in the co-working market, and obviously seeing our positioning with, our ground floor focus. And think that, is co-work, can they offload some retail space to co-working? So we've been actually looking really, with interest at what's happening in the retail space. And I think there's 2 very interesting trends happening. You've got the typical co-working model, you need businesses, right? Everyone talks about co-working like it's this brand new thing, a lot of buzzwords about it, but fundamentally co-working is serviced offices with obviously some differences. And so co-working will work in where there are business hubs. So we're doing one in Manchester, which we're opening in November. We're looking at, so we've got 9 at the moment. We're looking at some of the big regional cities, but we're thinking obviously about those secondary cities and where can co-working go. And we think retail is actually a really interesting opportunity, but it's going to be a different model. And if you look at what people are doing now, and how they're working, and these commuter towns, we just think it's very, very interesting that you've got a real growth of freelancers, remote workers. You've got big businesses now pushing their people not to work, not to work in the office 2-3 days a week or a day a week, whatever. And fundamentally, these guys don't want to work in coffee shops because they're not a great place to work, and they don't want to work on the kitchen table. And we've been really looking quite closely at actually taking a co-working model for freelancers, a proper workspace, and actually putting it on the high street. So I do think co-working actually will potentially make a move onto the high street. I don't think it's going to be the saviour for these retail parks who've got 20,000 square foot spaces. That won't work. But certainly with our brand, and I think where the state of the high street and the co-working sector, I actually think you may see at some point co-working coming into the high street, and it's something where it'll be an adaptation of what we've got at the moment, but I think it could be very, very interesting.
So if we've got about 30% of our retail floor space in town centres, and for quite a few of them, Karen, like your own town in Camberley, there's been a constant recycling of those properties. I can remember not that long ago you were losing a lot of office employment, converting to residential. But your authority is perhaps extremely well known for the tenacity with which your members have tackled your town centre.
Yes. Well, for us in Camberley, I think what we believe in is our place. So first and foremost, we're probably the ones that should be investing in it. And let's be honest about it, if we don't invest in our place, why should we expect the private sector to do that for us? I think we are in a position where we can now borrow money at very reasonable rates. We don't have to take that private sector view where we are, thinking about how much of a percentage of return we have to give to our shareholders. What we have to ensure is that we have robust business cases that enable us to borrow that money and be sure that we can repay it, and we can repay it over a longer period of time. So what that does for us, and I think what it does for the industry as a whole, is it means we can come to the table as a player. And I think what we can then look at is different types of ways of delivering footfall into the town centre. If there is a particular way in which we have to deliver that, either through a joint venture arrangement or through a different landlord-tenant model, then obviously we have the flexibility to do that. So I do think that local authorities should be investing in their local places. And one of the main reasons why I believe that is because we actually do know our community very, very well. I think with all of the different ideas that we're seeing around now, I think we've been in danger of just creating spaces that all look the same. And so we have got that real challenge now to differentiate, and how does our place look any different to anybody else's, because that's what will entice people in, I believe. But we need to make sure that the different ideas that are out there are actually going to work for the physical place that you're looking at. And this whole concept of one size fits all is not really where we need to go. We need to understand the place we're working in and then deliver what the community wants and needs for that particular place. And this is where I think local authorities can work really well in that space, because we do understand our place, and we've had to, if you like, prop up those places in the past when other ventures have failed, because we can't walk away from our place. We're there for the longer term. So I think we're in that position where we are open for business far more now than we were before.
But some people would argue that councils are one of the problems, in the sense that if you want to change a shop from one use to another, it's frequently very difficult, particularly if you want to take it out of comparison sales into a workspace or indeed into a cinema. And some authorities are notoriously difficult, not permitting what they defined as the core 10 years ago from changing. And how does your authority respond to that?
Well, when I took over in 2010, the one thing that we did work hard at in Surrey Heath was our open for business policy, and that really generated itself from me looking at complaints, for example, through our planning system. And what was very, very clear to me is we have such wider responsibilities, things like the local economy, that we do have to drive improvements we do have to make growth in those areas. And so the planning process has to work for us as a service to deliver that. We're naturally mindful of the regulatory position with that, but actually it's about how do you work with developers to say, well, this may not work here, but actually have you thought about this? And I think that is a concept in the planning regime of the past where we've perhaps not been that player at the table to think of different ways of delivering an outcome that works for all. So certainly that open for business process that we have been developing over the last few years has paid dividends for us. And I think, again, because we do have that need to make sure we can sustain our local economy, we've got to recognise that we've got to help people to do that.
Well, it is quite difficult because one of the key areas a lot of people are exploring are food halls, and Altrincham, the great experiment there is, well, not experiment, the success story there is quite close to us. And there was that terrible instance where Time Out, who operate the magnificent market in Portugal, tried to do the same in Spitalfields and couldn't get planning. Ed, how difficult do you think it is? Your operation is difficult to classify.
Yeah.
Did you have any experience, what was your experience in trying to explain to a fairly strict authority about how you want to get around this?
Well, it helped having quite enlightened landlords who kind of understood what we wanted to do and was behind us, and obviously they have their connections with the local authority themselves. I think at the core of our business is still F&B, as I mentioned, and that kind of in our first building, we sort of adhere pretty much to the classic A3. There, most of the events we do are seated dinners. It's not a restaurant where you walk in and say table for two. We're pre-booking them, you know, for 100 people or 50 people or whatever it might be, but it's still, you know, within the sort of realms of what's allowed. And then, so we've been sort of, I suppose, when we started to see more events where there wasn't so much of a food element, we realised we probably needed a different space with a different use class, which we found next door, luckily. But I would say, yeah, probably sui generis, I don't know, would be if when we're looking for new sites, we're kind of going in there saying we're kind of our own thing. And it's tricky because there aren't really that many of them around.
I can't remember our own thing featuring the use class order.
So yeah, I don't know. I'm not a property lawyer either, so it's difficult. But I think I think for us, what we're finding is that potentially with our different sites that we're opening, they'll each have a different focus, and we'll be able to sort of behave according to what we're allowed to do for each site.
I'm slightly curious, have you ever thought about cinema? Because there are some, was it Wildwood or something they have with their surplus space? They set up a sort of bookable cinema. It is Wildwood, isn't it?
I think they did do one, yes.
Yes. Have you thought about going into the boutique cinema business, or how far would you extend your thinking? I mean, you're quite broad at church as it is. You do candle making, calligraphy.
Yeah, I think experience is kind of the fundamental thing. We want to kind of deliver extraordinary experiences. Foods is kind of probably where we have the most experience ourselves, and we're able to kind of bring chefs from Japan or Bangkok or whatever to London, and you get to kind of eat at their restaurants but in London without having to get on a plane. That was the kind of fundamental idea. But that's extended to, well, why don't we bring a Buddhist monk from Japan to teach people how to make like Buddhist vegetarian cooking and things like that. I'm getting lost here. Yeah, cinemas. I don't know. I think it's not in our it's definitely not in our expertise, and I think Everyman kind of does it pretty well, I'd say. But there are areas like hotels, for example, pubs with rooms, or kind of expanding on that idea that we feel that we could kind of bring, our style of kind of, it's really about customer service as well, what we do. On the event side as well, you have someone kind of looking after you throughout the whole process. We have in-house production, we can provide food and drink, there's someone who's friendly and accommodating. And I think if you extend that to hotels or, any number of things, like ultimately it's about delivering a great experience for somebody. So I think we'll see what the future holds, but cinema might be a step beyond for the moment.
But it is not that if you look at, for example, the great coaching inns that used to be the core of many a town centre, and you think about how they worked, in a sense, they mixed all of these. They were frequently known for space you could rent to work in, usually workshops. They were sort of equivalent of a car servicing centre. They also let you stay. Some people lived in them all year round. Just how far do you think this process should or could continue in trying to take the high street away from what are essentially highly specialised units into something that offers a much deeper experience?
I mean, I'd love to talk to all three of these guys actually after this session, because working with specialist operators in their own fields and bringing them into a large apart hotel scheme is exactly what we love to do. Like, we're great at running and building, designing and operating an apart hotel, but we have no experience of F&B or cinema or co-working, all of which, we have the London warehouse opening in Manchester in Q1 next year, and we have all of those functions in that building. So we brought Bistro Tech up from London to operate the ground floor. We're working with Block Fitness Studios, again coming up from London, but working with the local community to introduce kind of the boutique fitness studio kind of concept. And we all operate under one brand, which will be the London Warehouse. And we will be native at the London Warehouse, Bistro Tech at the London Warehouse, Block at the London Warehouse. And all of us really just trying to bring as many people in together, pooling our marketing and sales resources to support each other. And I think the more energy you bring into these places through specialist operators, the more successful they're likely to be. So I'm fascinated with what these guys are doing, and dead keen to get your cards after this session.
I think sorry, I think that's what the best town councils are facilitating, and it's what the best landlords are facilitating. And I think you've got to look at, actually, people don't want diluted, homogenized experiences. They want the best in class people doing those experiences. You will do hotels better than either I could hope to do. Experiential catering we wouldn't want to get into. But actually, you've got to put us all together. But that's difficult because we all have different demands, whether it's space or whether even levels of rent that we can pay. So you need someone who can take that global piece, that global look. I mean, Karen, it sounds brilliant what you're doing in Camberley. The two venues that we've signed where we've got very, very engaged schemes that have been driven across the town by the councils in Lincoln and in Wokingham. And they're doing exactly that. They're looking at it, so one more so than the other in terms of direct hands-on purchasing the land, the other just really carefully curating it. And local councils in towns have that ability to do that and should, and I think it's brilliant. And I think we could all, adapt our offers in some ways and see ourselves being part of that collective high street experience. Yeah. But I think, the more enlightened landlords are doing it on the bigger schemes too. It's more difficult out of town because, in the big shopping centres out of town, because there's not a natural residential community. But, there are a lot of schemes, fortunately. We all bitched and moaned about it at the time, but the tough planning regime of 20 years ago at least pushed a lot of our big developments back into town centres. We hated it at the time. We hated it in cinema, we hated it in retail, but we're in a stronger place now than America is. I mean, America is distressed both in retail and cinema because everything was plonked out of town and things take a turn for the worse, and suddenly you have tumbleweed rushing through really dreary, derelict, out-of-town places, and it becomes a vicious circle rather than a virtuous circle. So we've got some advantages over here. I mean, I don't see it as all doom and gloom. Yeah, it's got to change, it's got to evolve, but get exciting new operators from whatever sectors, take a punt on them, and that's where you have to be a council, or that's where you have to be a landlord that's willing to put in a cinema occasionally. We don't pay rent, by the way. And that's a consideration. We do bring great footfall. We do bring great adjacencies and stuff. And you've got to be able to jigsaw it like that. And as I said, people are doing it. I'm not going to start name checking because I'll miss someone off, but there are great landlords that we're working with that are doing that. Great town centres that are doing it. Sorry.
I mean, you have got to bring footfall up, and you've got to realise as well that in a number of local authority areas we're all having to provide more housing in those areas, and so actually we're having to create community spaces which people can actually use and want to use. So you've got to entice people out, and it's a bit like you get a little bit bored with the online shopping concept and people don't want to shop. I mean, how many times are we as parents saying to we don't want our kids sitting in front of screens? Well, we don't want any ages sitting in front of screens. We want them out enjoying the space. And our job is to make that space as pleasurable as we can. And with these guys' help, we can create something where people want to be, rather than inside on a screen, doing their business.
The little screens do keep the little darlings quiet for a while, and I won't knock that. But so, Crispin, you're not terribly optimistic for the 2.5 million square feet of floor space lying around Colchester. And you mentioned America, and they turned fairly early to sort of co-working models at the back of Staples and various. How do you feel about those experiments?
I don't. Well, a bit desperate, perhaps. No, look, fundamentally, if it's a workspace, it needs to have light. It needs to be a place where businesses want to be, and that's why when we've been approached by lots of agents, say, would you consider this retail park with this giant space, but there's not the natural light? That's co-working is definitely not going to be the solution. It's not going to be the thing that's going to come in and save these big, retail buildings. But look, I think experience is key, right? There's been an attitudinal change. We've seen it from work, and that's where we can comment. People now are moving away from the Regis, the Starbucks style. They want something more barista, which is where I think it was quite similar to we're delivering an experience that's personal. So I think experiences are going to be key for the high street. I think, and like I said earlier, I think co-working, there is a very interesting potential to bring a form of co-working onto the high street. I think you only have to look at just the work that people are doing, as I mentioned earlier, more real growth, exponential growth of freelancers. And I think there was a stat I read the other day, it's like by 2025, 40% of the US, it was a US stat, but 40% of the US employment market was going to be self-employed. That's like 70 million people working for themselves, either some will work in businesses, but a lot of them will be working from the coffee shop to the kitchen table. I think that's where we're definitely we're looking to innovate. We're speaking to a few landlords, we developed a pay-as-you-go co-working product, so it's like retail friendly, similar to it's like a mix between, based on, but similar to Pure Gym, but like Uber meets Oyster Card for hot deskers, comes with an F&B offering. But what it is fundamentally we're humans, so we like social interaction, which is why the kitchen table will work for half a day or a day, but you're not going to do it permanently because it's not the best place to be. And coffee shops, they are fraught with all of the issues that we know. They're not proper places to run your business. So we see as this growth of sort of freelancing and people working for themselves grows. We think that's where co-working could filter into the high street. And our view is the commuter towns are the perfect place for it, where you've got people that want to get into London.
I think we need to realise as well that the kind of office space that we used to have in our local centres is not fit for purpose anymore. That's probably why you're seeing a lot of permitted development rights being used to convert those to residential units. What we do know, for example, in Surrey Heath, 90% of our businesses are small, medium enterprises, and so the co-worker space absolutely plays to that piece. And so I think, that opportunity to pull that footfall that you're losing back in for the lunchtime economy, for all of those things, that's the way we've got to look at how does the actual place work on a 24/7 basis, and how do we help sustain that during those periods?
Okay, well, after that, I'm sure a number of people would like to ask you some difficult and awkward questions. So are there some people that would like to ask some questions? Looking at some familiar faces, I can't believe you don't want to ask something challenging.
Hi, Alistair. Nigel Pode, Insight Asset Management. I think all these ideas and concepts are fantastic. But in your slide, Alistair, you showed a picture of Newton Aycliffe. How and can you make these sort of ideas and concepts work in places like that?
Sorry, like what?
Newton Aycliffe. You showed a photograph of it on your slide.
I think we all know very well there are some places, to use the meaningless phrase, challenging. And that's certainly one. And I would not have the temerity to offer a suggestion without charging you for it. But I think many of us have spent, for example, a lot of time looking at the new towns. And bearing in mind the great success at Bracknell, took nearly 20 years to deliver. And I think we need to be mindful of how difficult it is to change buildings characterized by what you might politely describe as architecture that is no longer popular. And I think at the heart of many of these challenges is the quality of the environment. Turning up in Cambridge and doing something interesting is not hugely difficult, but in many places I think we have to acknowledge they really don't look, they're so big a problem, you're not quite sure where to start, and the new towns are particularly true of that. And there's quite a few others I know we've all trying to work at where there is an equally sized challenge. I think the question I would pose, since so many of us talk about these sort of solutions, why is it so slow to be taken up in a lot of places?
So, well, from my perspective, our solution, or something. I mean, this is tiny piece. I think may take a very, very small proportion of experiential things. Great, and I think everything should be more experienced, but they're not going to. It's not going to be the saviour of the high street. So I wonder, and we're not a retail expert, but I think with the housing crisis, I think you look at places like where you mentioned earlier, surely that needs to go as retail. We just need to acknowledge that's not going to be retail. We need to build some houses, and that should be, there should be a planning change, and we're going to see retail being absorbed as turned into residential. I don't know.
Karen,
Seems sensible. But
you've got a lot of retail you need to get rid of, he says politely.
Yes.
Do you know, in Camberley, we haven't.
It's quite compact.
We're working, our voids at the moment are about 5%. By Christmas, they'll be 0%. So actually, we are working very, very hard, very, very regularly to find different ways of occupying that space. So I think, just to go back to the question though, I think one of the reasons we decided to take the bold move of buying a lot of our town centre built environment is because of how long it was taking for things to change. And so one of the benefits that that's brought is actually we can process that change far more quickly because we're in the driving seat. And we don't, as I've said before, we don't have to create huge returns to, pension investors and so on. And we understand that problem. But local authorities, if they really want their places to change and be there for what their community, constantly tells you they want, then, you deliver, those people will come. And I think it was very much, the boldness of our membership and our elected members who have been driving this since 2012, when we realised that we were working with landlords that weren't in the same place as us. Then obviously taking that decision to buy it in 2016, we've moved, so amazingly quickly now that I now see, and I can see a changed environment within 5 years, whereas before I was probably looking at. We are building some residential space, but our 5.5 acre site on the London Road development is about very much a mixed-use environment. And I think one of the things we've recognised is we may have enough commercial sort of square footage, but actually we might have the wrong types. And so we're using that development to help us deliver the right type so that we can repurpose the rest. And, all of that work, that holistic approach to looking at your place helps us work with guys like you to deliver something different to the community. And there's no doubt about it, our local community wants something different. They do not want a cloned, shopping centre. And I think that people that are still going into that business in this day and age, well, those are the areas where I think we're going to have problems. We've got to understand what people need and want in that place and we've got to deliver to those aspirations, not, you know, as I say, a one-size-fits-all. And we know our place.
Yeah.
So we can actually say to people, I mean, I've had commercial people say to me, certain retail, quite big names, saying, oh, we want a rent reduction because actually, you know, we're not doing so well. When you ask them, well, what was your 5-year projection for that? They're only about 10,000 down on their 5-year projection and they're 3 years in. And you sit there and you think, well, hang on a minute, if my budget was only 10,000 out, I'd be laughing. You've got to start seeing that these bumps and troughs and everything, you've got to look at the longer term, and you've got to look at what is it you need to help keep these places vibrant, because that will serve your communities far better. And if we can keep footfall going, you know, we can keep people using car parks, we can keep people in jobs. So from our point of view, it pays to invest.
But you are a fairly affluent Surrey town. I'm saying, Guy, how small a place, you're opening in Manchester, which is a great metropolitan event, how small a centre would you think might work?
Well, we're working with one of Karen's neighbours, actually, Woking Borough Council. And they have
Morgan is the
Mr. Morgan, who's
Mr. Morgan, the
he's
famed Mr. Morgan.
a man from the same cut as Sir Howard Bernstein, I would say,
Yes,
who
yes.
likes to just kind of get things done. And
He's a wash and go guy.
he certainly is. And he's building, we're working with him on they're developing a 450 unit residential scheme, plus a 4-star conference hotel above the Peacock shopping centre.
Yep.
And you know, everything you've just said is the rationale that's supporting that development, which is it brings huge footfall into the city centre. It's literally above the shopping centre. It's a 3-4 minute walk to the station, and
But
it's exactly what that town centre needs.
But Woking, as I recollect, is not known for the quality of its architecture or the conservation areas.
Well, that's about to change. There's a man here who could tell you more about it.
But it is only 20-odd minutes from Waterloo, I presume.
Yes.
But when we go to talk about that Nigel mentioned, the type of centre where it is difficult to see what solutions might be brought forward, where it's not a community large enough to support perhaps something you would look at, it's not particularly affluent. Where do you think the authority should work towards in those areas?
If I could chip in, I'd say, and I genuinely, I don't know the town, specific town, and clearly there's a whole raft range of demographics in towns in different cycles and different wealth, etc. But the one thing I would always come back to is we are all fundamentally social animals. You know, and again, I'll unapologetically use cinema as the analogy here. You know, most of us have got fantastic home TV systems and Blu-rays and surround sound and stuff. We still love to go to the cinema because watching a scary film with 100 other people is a hell of a lot more scarier. Watching a rom-com with 100 other people is a hell of a lot more funny. And it's that collective social experience. I'm going to quote my chairman here, who has a habit of really putting things succinctly. He said, 2,000 years ago, people were gathering together in huge public arenas to watch entertainment. They're doing it now, and probably in 2,000 years, they'll still be doing it. Don't quite know what they'll be watching, but we want to get together. We want to have that social experience. And it's way too simplistic, and I don't want to apply it specifically to the town in question, but the right thing might be just to bulldoze the lot and put a brilliant park there with a lovely pub and a tiny little community cinema and stuff around the outside. But the point being is that in isolation, there are owners of that property for who demolishing it and laying grass makes absolutely no sense, which is why you need to look to the councils to come up with that, or the landlords in bigger urban developments to come up with that cohesive plan. I mean, we're part of the King's Cross Argent development. It couldn't be more removed. But what Argent have done there is astonishing. And anyone who went to King's Cross 25 years ago, and can pretend that they would have had the vision that these guys have had, is lying. But they've got this amazing thing. We're part of it rolling out. But in the middle of it, every 5th or 6th block, there's this wonderful grass open area. I mean, how tempting must it always have been to let's just stick another block in and get... But they place make. I know it's the word of the moment and everything, but they do. It's about place making. It's about curating. It's about understanding people's lifestyles. We all want to be back in the hub of things. And, we all need accommodation. We all need things to go out and do on a Saturday night. We all need sofa. We want to work there. And if you look at it in that joined up way, you curate it in a different manner.
We've just got a few minutes more. Have we got another question? Can you shout a bit?
Sorry, I wanted to ask David what kind of lease terms you can live with, because we can all appreciate the merits of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Is it a profit rent scenario?
The lease terms you could rent with. Are you overpaying, and will you sign up for 15 years upward only?
Well, we're working with some big institutional landlords now, and I think the reason we've been able to get traction with them is because we sign leases. So I think a lot of big landlords, and everyone's pretty much Rita here, but a lot of big landlords got burnt by management agreements. We keep it very, very simple. But every landlord is different. So some that are looking to hold, they may be more interested in a base rent with a turnover, so we can deliver them above market rent. Fundamentally, if a space is doing well, we're wholesaling their space, so there is margin there to share. And others, it's just a straight, it's a 10, 15-year lease with what we think is a fair market rent. We're on the ground floor, so we slightly get it discounted. And landlords like us in their buildings because we're only taking a small proportion of it. You know, we're taking 10, 15,000 square foot of a 100,000 square foot building. But most importantly, because it's visible from the ground floor, they view it as almost like a marketing piece, an amenity to attract other tenants that's going to help accelerate lettings in the upper buildings. So we're not just another co-working operator saying, you know, I'm not going to mention any names, you know, we want 50,000 square foot floors to, you know, there's more strategy for landlords for it. But in answer, long-term leases.
We've got one last question.
I had a visit of, Alan Harrison, Montague Evans, of Wigan yesterday. Nigel Poad maybe actually developed a scheme, and you may even have advised. And there's probably 300 too many retail units in Wigan now. But residential doesn't work. None of these uses are going to be able to get kick-started there. How do we get places like Wigan, which is well connected, there's lots of demographics around there, how do we get any comprehensive development to work? Because we all know that project to make Wigan Town Centre work is going to cost 100, 200, 300 million pounds of loss. And the government doesn't seem to have a policy for this. So is it just decline for the next decade, or will we see towns like that actually change?
I personally think for quite a few centres this is the challenge, and we tend to hear at events like this of the successes. You know, we managed to do a housing development in Walthamstow. Well, anyone can really do that where you get sales values at £500 a square foot plus. The Wigans of this world is more challenging, and I think you have really only one arena where the numbers won't work, and frequently they are so far from working as to make one despair. The only way you can do it is for the public sector to provide the necessary infrastructure and facilitation. Unfortunately, the scale of the challenge is well beyond the possible scale of resources available. And I can't see, as much as I would like, a way around that.
Well, if sorry to jump in there, but if Argent could do it at King's Cross, I mean, I know it's city centre, but my God, what a dog's dinner that was. And if they can transform that in the way that you've just described, I mean, to apply that same kind of visionary exercise to towns like Wigan, surely there is some ability to imagine what it might be in a new incarnation, and for someone to kind of see that through, that vision through with local authority support. It would never happen without it.
Well, King's Cross started over 30 years ago. Argent, that was the third developer competition. The interesting question was, how did a site so big, so well connected in such a part of London, lie fallow for so many decades, is, I think, as much as admiring the end achievement. Right, I think we've come to the end of our time, and I'd like to thank you all for your tolerance, patience, and understanding, and I do hope you found that very useful. But I'd hope you would join me in thanking, I think, what was the most interesting panel I've had to listen to for quite some time. And would you like to join me in thanking them very much for their contribution? Thank you very much, guys. That was great.